Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Tom. Thank you all for coming out, especially coming out to a paper with the words philosophy of science in the title. I'm hoping you will find that philosophy of science, as I sort of interpret it here, which sounds dry as bones, can in fact be very exciting and is in fact very helpful to us. This quote from Daniel Dennett mentions, he uses the word, well, the quote as you might see is, there is no such thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination. I might not have used the word baggage, but there are philosophical implications to much of science. I'm just going to check it. Is it not on? Thank you. A little problem there. Had been ignored by the scientific community. No one had even taken the trouble to criticize it. It was just simply ignored. And I was sort of mentioning this to a fisheries biologist colleague of mine, and I guess I was sort of complaining about biologist colleagues, and he said, well, John, your problem really isn't biology at all. Your problem is philosophy of science. That's the subject area, this resistance to discovery claims. Well, at that time, I hardly knew what philosophy of science was, and I'm not sure I fully understand it now, but as we get into it, I think you'll see that it can be quite helpful. Michael Polanyi is one of sort of 2 or 3 major philosophers of science. As the title of this book indicates, scientist and philosopher, he started out as a scientist, a chemist, an analytical chemist. And he actually developed a chemical theory called adsorption theory, which is now completely accepted and has been for some time. However, Polanyi encountered a great deal of scientific resistance, not just to the theory, but even to opportunities to present it and discuss it with his colleagues. And this had such an effect on him that he actually switched from being a scientist to being a philosopher of science, saying, what is this thing about this resistance amongst scientists themselves to new ideas? In Polanyi's case, it was so bad that to his students, he said, now, we know that this absorption theory is the correct interpretation, but for examination purposes, keep using the old theory, even if it's wrong, if you want to pass the exams. That's the way it was. It would be like John Green speaking at the University of British Columbia to a class maybe of cultural anthropologists saying, we know the Sasquatch exists, but you better stick with myth and supernatural being if you want to pass courses in this class. Polanyi talked about the difficulty in getting a hearing for an idea that's somewhat unwelcome. And he used the term here, hostile audience. I don't think he meant an audience that actually threw eggs or stones at the speaker. I think hostile in this sense is a hostile takeover in business or a hostile witness, and an unwilling, uncooperative audience. And he says, a hostile audience may in fact deliberately refuse to entertain novel conceptions, precisely because its members fear that once they have accepted this framework, they will be led to conclusions which they rightly or wrongly abhor. And here we are a group trying to present, well, we don't think they're novel conceptions, but the Sasquatch, as an existing North American mammal, is a novel conception to many people. And now, why would people, the word abhor is quite strong, but why would people sort of abhor this idea? This is an illustration from Adolf Schultz's classic 1969 book on primate anatomy, and it shows, it doesn't include the bonobo, the pygmy chimpanzee, which should appear there, but it does include the orangutan, chimpanzee, gorilla, and human. And what we are saying, the conclusion we are saying is that even if we included the bonobo, this array would still be incomplete. There should be another great ape in there, probably slotted maybe between the gorilla and the human. Not only another great ape, one that's habitually bipedal, and even worse, right here in North America. I do want to make one comment, and that is on the ape-human dichotomy, for years there's been rather a bold line between the great apes and the human. And it sometimes caused a bit of divisiveness within this very community. Is it ape? Is it human? Well, I want to quote from a recent book, and we're acknowledging, and we'll be acknowledging John Green's contribution over the years. And I want to acknowledge the fact that only 2 months ago he told me about a book that I really should have, so he continues to help the rest of us. Anyway, this is called The Upright Ape by Dr. Aaron Filler, and he says, recently the long-standing agreement in the scientific community on how we define the terms ape, in quotation marks, and human, in quotation marks, has been in a state of flux. And he quotes the work of Russell Tuttle, who is a co-author of a paper titled, Are Human Beings Apes, or Are Apes People Too? And this is the current thinking, and Jeff can talk about this much more knowledgeably in physical anthropology. This ape-human thing is largely semantic. So anyway, Polanyi talking about people like us trying to propose a new system of thinking, the Sasquatch as existing. Proponents of a new system can convince their audience only by first winning their intellectual sympathy for a doctrine they have not yet grasped. Well, today, speakers such as me are very fortunate because here is an audience who, because of intellectual sympathy, have grasped the doctrine of the Sasquatch as great ape. And indeed, as Polanyi said, those who listen sympathetically will discover for themselves what they would otherwise never have understood. And we have been through this process. We have listened sympathetically, we have read sympathetically the work of John Green and a few others, and we have discovered something that I, for one, would never have understood otherwise. And this process, he says, produces disciples forming a school, the members of which are separated for the time being by a logical gap from those outside it. I believe we are such a school as that. And we also, and I'm sure everyone here can give an example of feeling separated from those outside it who have a different point of view. I'm going to change they here to we because we are that school. We think differently, speak a different language, live in a different world, and at least one of the two schools is excluded, rightly or wrongly, from the community of science. Well, I have an example of that because I have a colleague, he's actually a plant ecologist. He's very sympathetic to the idea of the Sasquatch being existing. He's here in British Columbia. But he says he's a skeptic. I think he's actually agnostic. He's quite open-minded. But he gives talks on food plants that humans eat. And he said, of course, many of these could be eaten by the Sasquatch, if it exists. So he gives this talk, and every time he says the word Sasquatch, he said, if it exists. Well, in our conversations, I don't hear people talking about the Sasquatch if it exists. We have this commonality, so we can skip that, We do speak a different language. And I guess in some ways, we live in a different world, a world where the Sasquatch does exist. But the point being, at the end here, rightly or wrongly, a group such as this, such as us, is excluded from the larger community of science. Polanyi goes on talking about another dispute, two other theories. He said, talking about these disputes more closely, it appears that the two sides do not accept the same facts as facts, or still less the same evidence as evidence. And this is kind of interesting because we are a member of that one school. Oh, so. Now, what is that evidence? Well, here is some of that evidence. Those who do not accept this wonderful display of physical evidence for the Sasquatch, this display of plaster casts and track photos, say the other side said, we don't accept that evidence because it's been countered by photographs such as this, claims such as this, that all those tracks are a hoax. So they brought forward tracks like this, but we're saying, no, that's not evidence that real tracks are hoax. This is evidence that the tracks fabricated by hoaxers bear no resemblance to real tracks. Look at the square toes. And look at, in this case, the square heel. So what is this evidence for? It's considered evidence to prove that Sasquatch tracks are hoax, yet we see it quite differently. And as Polanyi says, indeed, one side may disregard some of the evidence altogether in the confident expectation that it will somehow turn out to be false. And I guess many people are convinced that in fact the tracks have been proven to be false. The film, the Patterson-Gimlin film, because of some counterclaims, have also been, concluded by many people to be hoax. I'd like to move on to another philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, considered the father of philosophy of science, writing in 1970. And Kuhn talked about paradigms, and I think many of you know that the current paradigm for the Bigfoot is basically something that doesn't exist. If you believe that, you probably also believe in Bigfoot. Comments like that. And that, of course, is a paradigm we would like to change. We would like to introduce a new paradigm, the Sasquatch, as existing. So Kuhn says, but if a new paradigm is ever to triumph, it must first gain some first supporters, men and women who will develop it to the point where hard-headed arguments can be produced and multiplied. And here, of course, we're referring to John Green. First supporters, people working almost in isolation, pretty much in isolation. First supporters, developing it to the point where other people, such as Jeff Meldrum, myself, many others, investigators here, come along, and we can actually work with that and hopefully improve on it. And as he says here, and even those arguments, when they come, are not initially decisive. Well, John Green could probably say, yes, tell me about it. How many years has John Green been making these arguments? They haven't been decisive. They're still not decisive. However, Kuhn is somewhat hopeful. He says, but because scientists are reasonable men and women, one or another argument will ultimately persuade many of them. And I guess to some extent we all choose our favorite argument. For me as a wildlife biologist, it's a number of things, but certainly tracks are very, very important. Others might choose, say, well, we're on the edge of having DNA proof. Maybe that's going to be the argument that is decisive in persuading them. According to Kuhn, there is no single argument that can or should persuade them all. Rather than a single group conversion, what occurs is an increasing shift in the distribution of professional allegiances. And there's some evidence that this, in fact, is occurring amongst our scientific colleagues. And again, I think Jeff can comment on this better than I. Whoops. No, that's right. And he talks about people like ourselves who try to improve upon and develop the hypothesis. If we are competent, we will improve it, explore its possibilities, and show what it would be like to belong to the community guided by it. And I'm quite honored to belong to a community like this. What is it like to belong to a community guided by this new paradigm? It's wonderful. There's all this support, there's all this interest, there's all this affirmation, without which it can be very difficult to proceed. And all the more credit to John Green for working without such a large community like this, for working sometimes with one, two, sometimes no real supporters. That's right. Now here he says, this process. As that goes on, if the paradigm is one destined to win its fight, the number and strength of the persuasive arguments in its favor will increase. This interests me because he talks about its fight, and people talk about that there's been this fight or conflict or debate, the Sasquatch debate. And many people, it seems to me, have concluded that the debate has happened and we've lost. And I keep asking, gee, I would like to contribute to this debate. When did it take place? Perhaps I was away. Perhaps I was simply out of the room. But so many people act as if there's been a debate and it's over. And this is kind of important. George Kitson Clark, a Cambridge historian, wrote in his book, The Critical Historian, says that when a conflict is over, historians are too inclined to take the case for one side and all its partisan stories straight into the canon of history without looking at the evidence or trying to find out what the other side may have had to say. And this is what seems to have happened. We keep seeing this writing of people who write that, no, this subject is finished. And I'm saying, wait, we haven't yet got a chance to present our side. But Now, in favor of the process, Kuhn says, as that goes on, if the paradigm is destined to win its fight, the number and strength of persuasive arguments in its favor will increase. Well, we know that eventually it will prevail. In which case, gradually, according to him, the number of experiments, articles, and books based on the paradigm will multiply. Well, that is certainly happening. That's good. Still more men and women convinced of the new view's fruitfulness will adopt the new mode of practicing normal science until at last only a few holdouts remain. This word fruitfulness is pretty important. The attributes of a good hypothesis include its testability, simplicity, and its fruitfulness, which is something like predictiveness. And if we subscribe to the great ape hypothesis that the Sasquatch is a North American large primate, we can say that, okay, if you see an animal walking across a clearing, you're getting a good look at it, it's walking on two legs, it's upright, it's huge, hair-covered, walking with long swinging arms, a short, thick neck, you know that it's a Sasquatch. The hypothesis is fruitful because if you got closer, you could anticipate that it will also have a flat nose, deep-set eyes, brow ridges, and a rounded chin. This is what the hypothesis does. And also that if you're camped in that area at night, you might expect to hear loud vocalizations or see some evidence of projectile throwing. Now, let's move on to our last person we want to talk about here, legal scholar Cass Sunstein. And Sunstein was very helpful in many ways because he put names to some of the aspects that the philosophers talked about, such as reputational cascade. In a reputational cascade, according to Sunstein, people think that what they know is right, or what is likely to be right, but they nonetheless go along with the crowd in order to maintain the good opinion of others. And I think we're aware of this. We have colleagues, we have friends, very concerned about their reputation. They may not agree with what the mainstream thinks. Even the most confident people sometimes fall prey to this, silencing themselves in the process. And the result, consequently, dysfunctional norms may survive even in the presence of a huge silent majority of dissenters. Well, this is what's happening. I don't know if the dissenters are really in a majority, but certainly some dysfunctional norms are surviving, and certainly the dysfunctional norm of the hoax hypothesis. Fearing the wrath of others, people might not publicly contest factual judgment, practices, and values that they privately abhor. Now this is an interesting thing. How large is this group of people who basically, or privately, are members of this very community, but not publicly? If conformity is rewarded, the problem is especially severe for the earliest disclosers or dissenters, who may bear especially high cost because they are conspicuous, individually identified, and easy to isolate for reprisal. Well, here again, we can think back to John Green, an early dissenter, and then Grover Krantz in the scientific community, you know, who were isolated and identified. He talks about earliest disclosers or dissenters. Sunstein is interesting because he talks about two kinds of dissenters: contrarians, who are simply sort of difficult, and disclosers, who actually want to disclose, are trying to disclose information that they have and that the rest of us should be aware of. And if the earliest dissenters are successfully deterred, dissent is likely to be exceedingly rare. Fortunately for us, John Green was not successfully deterred. He may have been deterred, but not successfully. I'd like to talk a little bit about deterrence. In about, it was 2010, maybe early 2010, I was approaching the end of this book, the second book I had written, in which I was actually claiming that the Sasquatch does exist, and in fact may already have been discovered. I was sent 2 books for review for a journal. The first one, Anatomy of a Beast, Obsession and Myth on the Trail of Bigfoot, was by Michael McLeod. This book was published by the University of California Press, an academic press, very prestigious. In that book, MacLeod says, if people can delude themselves into believing in the existence of an 8-foot-tall ape man, what on earth might they be thinking about truly important matters? Oh my goodness, talk about feeling deterred. That's a very strong statement. Fortunately for me, about that time, a retired university professor of philosophy from University of Calgary moved to the Valley, and I started having coffee with him. And I said, John, what about this? He said, oh no, it's okay. It's a rhetorical question. He's obviously writing from the point of view that he's satisfied that the debate, the conflict is over. He may be wrong, but never mind. Well, I don't know. Anyway, it was hard. And then a second book was sent to me, and this was Bigfoot, Life and Times of a Legend by Joshua Buse. Buse was a little more careful in his language, but nevertheless clearly had concluded that the Sasquatch was not an existing large mammal. We learned a lot from Buse's writing from a review of it in Publishers Weekly. The reviewer there wrote, Buse is at his amused best when following the exploits of Bigfoot's human handlers, which I think that's us. The colorful band of true believers, hoaxers, and pseudo-documentarists who constructed this greatest of all shaggy dog stories. Oh my goodness. Well, maybe we can't fault Buse for this, but he certainly left that impression with this reviewer. Now, does this mean that everyone who's cast the Sasquatch tracked and documented is actually a pseudo-documentarist? Is that what we are? Is that what John Green did in all his books? Pseudo-documentation of reports, if there is such a thing as pseudo-documentation. And those of us who find the evidence compelling, does that make us true believers? And almost worst of all, we're lumped with hoaxers. My goodness, no, please don't count hoaxers with us. Anyway, so deterred, yes, but fortunately not successfully deterred. And this continues, deterrence continues. Anyway, going on here, Sunstein says, once the number of disclosures or dissenters reaches a certain level, there may be a tipping point that produces a massive change in behavior. And there's a great line from Tom Steenberg. It was at the Bellingham conference the evening before, about 2005. Larry, the father of the woman who did the memorial footage, were in this room having coffee, and Larry says to the group of it, he said, you know, I think you guys are on the edge of something really significant. And Tom, in his droll voice, said, well, Larry, for about 20 years now, we think we've been on the edge of something really significant. And John Green could say that even more so. But anyway, this is a hopeful sign, this tipping point. And there are many here who are more aware than I am of some upcoming DNA and evidence. Maybe this is going to push us over the tipping point. I don't know. The problem, according to Sunstein, it's very difficult to initiate the process leading to that tipping point. It's especially so if early disclosures are subject to social and legal punishments. Well, John Green can speak for himself about well, not really punishment, but social aspects of this. Jeff can probably talk more about, that of academic colleagues, and I'm aware of that a bit about too. I thought legal punishment was a little bit strong until I've just been having some recent correspondence with Linda Newton-Perry in Oregon, who's been showing me some emails where Oregon drivers who reported a Bigfoot to the police had their license suspended until they could be cleared by a doctor or a psychiatrist. And this happened in a couple of cases with logging truck drivers. And of course, there's tremendous monetary, social repercussions, but these are legal and monetary repercussions. It no longer occurs, but apparently it occurred for some time. It was basically filing a false report. And so one logging truck driver who had a Sasquatch report said, but of course there's no way I'm going to report it. I can't afford to lose my license, which apparently wouldn't happen anymore, but would back then. He said, I know what happened to my friend. This is really quite bizarre. Anyway, Sunstein says, here we can see the beneficial role of those who are particularly naive or courageous. and hence willing to say exactly what it is that they see. I like the way he said, naive or courageous is that maybe you're naive, but actually maybe you're being courageous. Or maybe you think you're courageous, but actually you're quite naive. But in any case, I like the first one, where sometimes we are naive. I've certainly been naive with colleagues. We're discussing our research, and I'm saying, gee, I just got the greatest Sasquatch report, and I want to tell it. Thinking, John, do you know who you're talking to? You know, eyes roll up, eyes glaze over. My colleague says, I'm sorry, John, I really have to go. And of course, you know. Okay. Anyway, but that will change, you know, it will be quite interesting. But Sunstein says, people silence themselves, not because they believe they are wrong, but because they do not want to face the disapproval that they think would follow from expressing the view they believe to be correct. Now this is interesting because, you know, we have all these sort of like closet scientists or scientists with an undisclosed interest in the Sasquatch, and in the larger population, many people who privately say, carry on, it's good stuff, you know, but may not say that in a larger group. Sunstein is helpful because he puts names on this. He said the underlying problem here is pluralistic ignorance. Ignorance on the part of most or all of what most people think. I think he's saying that actually a lot of people might agree with what we in this room accept. Oh, sorry, there should be one more. And there was one more slide. He basically said, this is a serious, people silence themselves. This is a serious social loss, and we might add, and a serious scientific loss, because those those people who come forward after we've gone over the tipping point, that will of course be very welcome, but it would have been even more welcome had they come along to occasions such as this, and they talked to some of the people here and said, I have a Sasquatch report I'd like to share with you. And some have, and some have said, I want to share with my report, but you don't need my name. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. I just wanted to say, you know, that I found philosophy of science to be very affirming, and that's why I wanted to share some of this with you today, is that, you know, I won't say it's normal for a discovery claim such as the Sasquatch to take a century and a half and still not be properly acknowledged, but there are these things operating that it's good to know about. Scientific resistance is normal. Some of these aspects of human nature are normal. Professor David Walsh here was sharing a lot of that with me. He's very aware of this sort of thing. And I think we're going to hear more about it. And there's going to be this interest looking back, you know. We're going to cross that, have that tipping point. It's going to be okay to talk about Sasquatch reports and observations. And then the question is going to be asked, gee, where was the scientific dialogue leading up to this discovery? Why are scientists surprised that the Sasquatch turns out to be existing? I think this is what's helpful to us as we struggle amongst ourselves and with ourselves. Anyway, thank you very much.